Welcome to another episode of Inside the War Room. Ryan right here as always, and our third episode, I think, at least three in a row, on China. And so this will be a different perspective as we're talking about not U.S. China, but Australia and China. And we have excuse me, we have on Eryk Bagshaw from the Sydney Morning Herald. He is the China correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, but he is right now, unfortunately, because of travel restrictions. Yeah, well, I say unfortunately. I don't know if it's unfortunate you're in Australia or not. I think that's what the byline says, but you're in Australia. The view looks beautiful, Eryk. So is it unfortunately or fortunately that you're in Australia? And thank you for coming on.
Good to be with you, Ryan. Yeah, look, it's a mixture of both. I think at the moment here in Australia, it's a pretty good place to be for COVID. There's very little transmission, and right now we are also experiencing extraordinary levels of tension with China. So probably safer to be in Australia at the moment, but still, China is still the biggest story of our times.
Okay, yeah. So let's hop into that. We were talking offline, kind of. Obviously, I'm a ask the kind of the dumb questions, and you give us the smart answers here. I do remember, I think we covered this in the newsletter, that that Australia had said back in March, April, that they were wanting a World Health Organization to go to China to do a mission to see what's going on there. They were pushing against Trump's assertions that it was released from some Wuhan virus lab, but they did want to know what are the origins of the virus, and that seemed to kind of start this trade war, however you want to describe it. It started with barley. Now we're talking about iron potentially. What coal? What's going on? And what did I miss? And what's the, if you can, what's both sides' perspective on this issue?
Well, to really get back to the origins of this dispute, you probably actually have to go back to 2018, and that's when Australia made the decision to ban Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications network provider, from the 5G network. So Australia was the first country in the world to make that decision because it was worried about the security risks of allowing a state-backed Chinese firm into the 5G network. What that then set off was a period of rising tension. And then by 2020, we get to the coronavirus. And then in April, again, Australia was the first country in the world to publicly call for an inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus. And that was for two reasons. Firstly, the US Trump administration was pushing an unsubstantiated theory about the virus coming out of the lab. And secondly, China was not allowing independent inspectors in to let people know more about the virus. So you had two superpowers kind of going at each other.
Right.
And Australia said, right, let's go through the middle and let's find out what actually happened here. Unfortunately, that really pissed China off because they saw that as kind of an attack on them. They saw it as Australia blaming China for the virus. And the call for an inquiry then actually basically spiraled into quite a bit of momentum. And within about 6 weeks, it did actually get up at the World Health Organization with more than 100 countries supporting it, including China itself, who had to kind of be brought into the diplomatic table. But after that, China started making somewhat of an example of Australia. It firstly hit barley and beef, two of Australia's exports to China, and they're worth a couple of $1 billion a year each in trade.
Yeah,
they're not huge, but they're not insignificant. And that was really sending a message. Australia continued to speak up on things like Hong Kong, Xinjiang, issues in the South China Sea, a whole range of big diplomatic debates that were going on. Australia continued to talk about them at multilateral forums and also among the ministers here. So you had this sense from China's perspective that Australia was sort of really pushing somewhat of a worldwide alliance, along with the US and then most recently the UK. And so that led to a kind of perception that there was this middle power. I mean, Australia is an island of 25 million people, bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and taking on China, a country with 1.4 billion people, spans the breadth of Asia. The disparity in terms of their power is enormous. But here was this uppity country down the bottom of the world sort of speaking up to China, and it didn't like it much at all. So what would happen then is you had more trade strikes. So by September, October, we were really looking at things like cotton, copper. What else do we have? There's about half a dozen exports. Then finally, last week, we got confirmation that China would be preventing Australian coal imports from entering the country. Now, this had come after quite a few months of Australian ships being stuck off the coast of China and unable to unload their coal, but it wasn't really officially confirmed. There's sort of this grey area. We don't quite know what's happening. Then Chinese state media confirmed that this had occurred, and that's the big one. That's Australia's coal exports to China are worth $14 billion a year. It's our third largest export, and a very substantial driver of key parts of the economy. So with that hit, really the Morrison government started calling out what it now sees as straight up economic coercion. And so we've reached a situation now where Australia and China's diplomatic ties are at their lowest level in 50 years and seem irreparably damaged at the moment.
Okay, and what was Australia a part of? Was it Australia, India, and what other nation that had like a joint military base agreement in that time period as well?
Yeah, so the Quad is an agreement between Australia, Japan, India, and the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And they run naval exercises, Malabar exercises they're called, and that group of countries joins, as kind of a military agreement, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. And so that again comes back to a perception that Australia is curtailing China's ability to operate, for instance, in the South China Sea, where it's disputed waters, and again is part of this global coalition that's trying to constrain China. So all of these factors kind of add together to a climate where China is increasingly unimpressed by Australia's actions.
So, but if I remember correctly, when they took the barley exports and they said we're not going to buy from Australia, they just increased buying from the U.S. and Brazil, maybe. So they were upset with the U.S., but I know they increased their soybean purchases during those time periods. It was weird from the U.S. side because they're like, okay, hey, we're mad at Australia. What Trump was saying was far more inflammatory than what Australia was saying, and they increased their imports from the U.S. And so, how do you guys view that, and how do you take that messaging? Because you're over here like, well, we're just trying to say we want to talk. Trump's over here saying that you guys created it. Like, why are we getting punished so hard?
Yeah, I mean, look at the situation with the US. With the US at the moment is that obviously they've just signed this a truce, basically, the China-US trade deal. After 18 months of a really bitter trade dispute with China. But just as that had kind of started to cool down a bit, the tensions with Australia rose. And so as part of that US trade deal, China has to match a certain quota of soybean imports and barley perhaps as well. So I don't think there's not a sense in Australia that the US is taking Australia's lunch from China in a sense. I think the reality is that whether it was the US, Russia, Indonesia, any of those other partners, China was always going to be able to find a source for those other products. And so barley, beef, wine, they're important, but they're not really significant industries. However, there is one big resource that China has yet to curtail, and that's iron ore. Australia is the world's largest exporter of iron ore. It accounts for up to 80% of the of supply at the moment, because Brazil's got a lot of capacity constraints because its mines in barley mines have been hit by two natural disasters and then the coronavirus. So Australia's the dominant player in the world iron ore market, and China doesn't have any other suppliers of that. But I think if it was to hit, Australian iron ore, it would be almost impossible to see how bilateral relations could get back on the right track, just because it's worth so much money and so important to the Australian economy.
So, you brought up 2 years ago, and I've read, and again, this piecing together reports, trying to understand the history here. I read some Australians have articulated that they were frustrated with maybe some anti-dumping regulations on the Australian side that frustrated the Chinese. I don't know how anti-dumping works in Australia, if it's the same as the U.S. Maybe what are your thoughts on the anti-dumping stuff from both sides? I think, from what I understand, maybe there's been some regulation going back and forth, and how much does that play into what we're seeing today?
Yeah, so actually Australia is a really prolific user of anti-dumping measures. The Australian government would argue that it has proof, for example, that Chinese steel is being dumped in Australia at discount prices and crowding out the local producers, basically by offering discount prices, which is what dumping basically means. But Australia is one of the largest users of anti-dumping measures in the world. And so when China points to Australian products being dumped into China, it kind of makes it an easier argument to make. But the problem is that Australian products aren't being dumped into China. They're not going in at discount prices. The Australian wine, for example, which has just been hit with a 200% tariff as part of this dispute, is among the most expensive wine in China. Very little evidence to suggest that it's actually being dumped there. Likewise, barley. The barley deals that Australia was signing were really high quality, high priced barley. Not the kind of stuff you just dump in there to try and crowd out other producers. So they've got these really spurious claims. The anti-dumping, the dumping measures that have been taken by Australia on things like Chinese steel, basically the Australian government says that those allegations are stacked up. And it has to provide a certain level of transparency in some of those investigations. The Chinese side, however, is not particularly fond of transparency. So what we end up seeing is a lot of these measures being taken through things like verbal instructions to traders. You don't get official notices or the Chinese customs officials really confirming many of the details, because if they did, most likely they'd be found in breach of World Trade Organization obligations. So you've got this situation where there's whispers going through the industry that ultimately gets through to the media. All of a sudden you're seeing that Australian wine or Australian resources are not getting through, but you haven't got official comment until you get a real state media confirmation from the Chinese side.
Okay, that's all very helpful. So I want to talk about the coal, but I want one more question about the barley. I see that you have a story that you put out about the farmers are backing Australia, taking China to the WTO over the barley. So when I think of barley, obviously I don't know the farming situation in Australia, but you would have, I'm sure, some large farmers, but also some small farmers in a pandemic world right now. Are these barley cuts disproportionately impacting the small farmers in Australia, or is it everyone's just kind of taking a lick, or are they able to find somewhere else to get the barley exported to?
It's really interesting. Saudi Arabia actually has stepped forward and is taking a heap of Australian barley all of a sudden. I think what's happened is basically farmers who are overproducing barley in Australia for the Chinese market. There's no way that Australia needs anywhere near as much as barley as it produces, and because China was such an insatiable customer, it was producing heaps and heaps of the stuff. And so there's a surplus of it obviously available in the market. And what that means now is that Australian barley farmers are offering, huge bales for discount prices. And Saudi Arabia is very happy to step forward and take that to feed, for animal feed mostly. And I suspect there are other countries in the region, particularly in the Middle East, who may come forward and want to take advantage of some of those discounts as well. I think it'll be a restructuring. If China is no longer Australia's major trading partner in some of those key areas, a lot of those farms will not only have to diversify their markets, but also diversify their crops, and they'll have to find plants or animals that other countries other than China have a demand for. Again, it's difficult because China's market is just so large.
Right.
You're talking about 1.4 billion people, right? So
right.
The scale of it is almost impossible to comprehend apart from anywhere like India. But India is also very complex because India has extraordinarily high agriculture subsidies. It's really a very protectionist economy. It's nothing like China in terms of its import quotas. So it's a really vexed, complicated situation, and I suspect it'll take a couple of years for Australian producers to kind of reorientate themselves.
Okay, so you said that coal was kind of the next escalation, and then of course you have iron, which would be the ultimate maybe check or checkmate or end of the relation, if you will. So from the so having a background in energy, I think the coal stuff may surprise people just how much coal is out there and and being used, especially by China. If they're not getting it from Australia, A, where are they getting it at? And then B, is the coal situation like you described with the barley? Is Australia overproducing at too much, or can they find other buyers, or what would you do to supplement if this is a long term shutout from China?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of a perfect storm for Australian coal. We've got a situation where, again, one of the largest customers in China is changing its supply lines. It's just signed a 3-year deal with Indonesia to import coal, and Australia will try and diversify towards Japan, Pakistan, India, but again, it's the markets. Coal's about the third largest export, so it's not huge, but still,
Yeah.
but still significant. And will other markets take it? Yes, for a time, but then of course, really, the writing's on the wall a bit because overall coal consumption's going down. Not only are power plants becoming more efficient and using less of it, we're heading towards a situation where all of Australia's major trading partners are adopting net zero emissions targets, except for Australia. Biden administration in the US, you'd expect to move quickly towards a net zero emissions target. Japan, South Korea, the UK, Europe, everyone's going in one direction. So Australia is very much an outlier there. And it is because key political communities in Australia, much like in the US, in some of those key states, have relied on fossil fuels and resources for a long time. And so they have an outsized influence on the electorate. And politicians have been scared of basically upsetting those key voters. But now, if the market's kind of being pulled from underneath people, both by trade sanctions and by climate change, that's a pretty perilous future for one of Australia's biggest industries.
And so, do you think China is looking at this, and they have an end goal here with Australia? I mean, I can't imagine the Australian government coming out and saying, "Hey, we're sorry about, asking to see what the origins of the virus are." In fact, I think China's kind of living on borrowed time on some level because if in March, when the coronavirus stuff was heating up here in the States and kind of in the West, if you had told me we'd still be talking about this at the level that we are now, I'd been surprised. Which meant that I presume by the end of this year, Europe, the EU, and the States would have been looking to China for answers, for questions, legit or not. They'd have been putting the pressure back on China. They haven't been able to do that because, well, they're still dealing with the pandemic, and it seems like every nation on some level is somewhat frustrated with how their nations handled it. So China's kind of gotten a free pass to kind of do what they want to do because they're not getting a lot of external pressure like they normally would because the local governments just don't have that kind of sustained will. So from Australia's standpoint, well, I was to say you're kind of on an island, no pun intended, but you are kind of out there on your own right now. Obviously, you have support of the U.S. and you, but do you guys feel like, okay, hey, we need more support? We're looking for a stronger backing. Is there some kind of goal from Australia's standpoint that you think navigate these waters? What's kind of the end game here with dealing with China because they do have a disproportionate size economy and people like you say, but if they're buying your goods, it's hard to get mad at them. If they're not buying your goods, it's kind of hard to deal with them.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a really important point. The fact is, in April, when they first called for the inquiry, Australia was very fortunate that it had contained the virus quite quickly, and so was in a position to try and throw a bit of its diplomatic weight around while the US and Europe were grappling with sizable outbreaks. So, the merits of calling for the inquiry, I think, will be endlessly debated. People can definitely argue that we stuck our neck out in doing so, but that is what happened. where we're at now is most recent. It's only a couple of weeks ago, actually, that the Chinese embassy in Canberra here, met up with some reporters and issued a list of demands, basically a list of grievances, rather, on a 14-point list. Now, on this list are things like Huawei. There's also national security legislation. There's stuff that basically tries to curb Chinese Communist Party influence in Australian politics.
Mm-hmm.
The whole range of things, even things like critical reporting on China by the independent media.
Okay, I've seen some of that. That's true, then.
That's right. Yeah. So the fact that the idea that the government in Australia would be responsible for unfriendly reporting in the media, right? So there's a fundamental misunderstanding on both sides in this debate, right? And what that list does, though, unfortunately, is it now leaves China and Australia in an intractable position, because if Australia was to move back on some of those policies or try and ameliorate some of them, that would be seen as a sign of weakness. And of course, China now has to continue to punish Australia until it wins some concessions. So it's a lose-lose situation. And the thing with diplomacy is, conventionally, you would have these discussions, might make a list of grievances, but you would do it diplomat to diplomat, and everything would be behind closed doors. Now that they chose to, because they cut off all ministerial contact with Australia, issue diplomatic threats via the media, we're now in a situation where it's hard for neither side has any room to move.
Right.
And so, from Australia's point of view, the end game, that's a multi-billion-dollar question. And the goal here is to reach a point where Australia can have frank discussions with China without fear of economic coercion.
Yeah. And
the logic goes that if they wear some of this pain for the next year, 2 years, maybe 3 years, then after a while, that relationship will start to equalize. Because if you start censoring yourself and you say that you can't talk about Hong Kong or you can't talk about Xinjiang, then of course, you're basically caving into some of those demands. And, I don't think it's reasonable for the public or business to expect the government of a liberal democracy to not speak out on human rights issues. And that's the situation, that's the trajectory we were heading in. So they've made a decision that if they don't speak up now, then they won't be able to ever in future. And all of a sudden, in 20 years' time, you may be in a situation where decisions are being made for you and your country by people outside your borders.
Right. Yeah. And see, I think what you're talking about there, when I talk about China, is if you look at Africa, I think the Belt and Road Initiative they're really, in my opinion, they're overextended, and not only overextended from a financial standpoint, I think they're overextended from a diplomatic standpoint, because, African nations that are emerging markets and they're trying to find their feet and they're trying to rid corruption, they're only going to take so much China stuff before they're like, you know what, we ain't paying you money back. We're going to throw you out of the country and we're going to do our own thing. Come do something about it. Australia, obviously, and, the US, we're going to handle a little bit differently, like you say. And so I find it interesting to hear the Australian perspective, because, in the US, the big debate is China going to take over, or will the US bomb them into oblivion and all this nonsense? But to me, there's a lot more nuance in some of the things that you're talking about here, is how the relationship is being handled. I find quite fascinating. So I'll let you go with this kind of two questions, I guess. First off, is there any way that Australia might divert? You said iron was the big export. Obviously, that's important to China. You being there, they're always building stuff and doing stuff. Is there a way that Australia says, you know what, China, tell you what, we're going to stick it to you. We're going to sell our iron somewhere else. Is that even possible? That could happen from the Australian standpoint, to put pressure on China, or is it too risky, or outside the government's hands, maybe even?
Yeah, I think if you were to start restricting iron ore, you'd basically be sanctioning yourself. Ultimately, it's the world's biggest buyer of iron ore.
Yeah.
There's no easy replacement for that market. Quite simply, no one else is building as much stuff. You need the iron ore to make steel, to build infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
So Australia has they call it kind of the lucky country, and for good reason. It has an extraordinarily large deposit of iron ore and other natural resources for a country this small, this population. So it's a natural advantage that many other places would kill for. And I think it just means that the government now has to actually spend some time thinking about the industries that are going to make it more successful in different economic areas. And that's, whether that's things like services or technology, things that America has always been really quite good at, and East Asia as well, because ultimately, we need to be better at things than just digging up rocks. But that's a question that the government has to grapple with, and the government and the question that companies have to grapple with all the while, because of the supply restrictions on iron ore. You now have a situation where the price of iron ore is going through the roof. So perversely, despite all of these trade strikes from China and Australia, which now probably cover about $20 billion worth of exports at a kind of upper end of the estimate, Australia will actually have a better trade balance with China this year because of the price of iron ore. And it's actually flowing back into the federal government revenue. So it's bringing in taxes. And so we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar boost to Australia's tax revenue base, despite all this tension with China.
Yeah.
But of course, that's not really a realistic situation for the long term. So they've got to make use of it while it's happening, but you've really got to plan for the future, because that kind of equilibrium cannot hold.
Well, it's fascinating, and I enjoy reading your work from up here in the States. And for the listener's perspective, I really appreciate it for you coming on. I reached out to you, it's an hour and a half ago, and said, never heard of me. Said, hey, we want to come on and talk about this. And you were ready, willing, and able, and took the questions rapid fire the best I could articulate them. And so I do appreciate that and your time. And we'll be following your work, as this is it's a story that it's so frustrating, because I did think that the reaction to Australia when they said, hey, we want to see an investigation, I thought it was very fair. I mean, like, I'm not a Wuhan lab theory guy. That's not my particular cup of tea. But I also don't think it's, to ask a question, hey, what happened here, when we have you lying to the World Health Organization. So, listen, the question Australia asked was fine. I thought, I didn't think there was really worth all of this hoopla. And so it's been interesting to kind of watch that. And then also how China has reacted with other nations who have been more critical of them since then. And so just want to hear the Australian perspective. And so I appreciate your time on short notice, especially. Where can people find your work, follow you? Where do we point them to as you continue to cover these stories?
Yeah, so follow along with us at the Sydney Morning Herald in Australia, and The Age. That's the newspapers. Look them up online. We do a hell of a lot of China coverage in Australia, possibly more than most places in the world, because it is such a big economic partner and a real political challenge at the moment. So check out our work there, and great to chat to you, Ryan.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And you know what? Maybe I've never been to Australia. I need a reason to go. Maybe I'll just fly down so we can talk Australia-China relations, if nothing else. So
absolutely welcome anytime.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.